This is America, and this is Capitol Heights, Maryland, where it is hot. Temperatures have already exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, around 38 degrees Celsius so far this year. But this isn't about one US city and one heat wave. Across America, summers are getting longer, they're getting hotter, bringing dangerous heat and haze from forest fires. Millions of Americans are having to adapt to a new climate reality. I'll have more on that later, but first, over to Alex Marquardt in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Bernard. The United States is no stranger to extreme weather, but it is getting worse. Wildfires burn through more than 3 million hectares every year, almost double what it was in the 1990s. Floods, both major and minor, are now happening somewhere in the country on 8 out of every 10 days. Storms and hurricanes are intensifying, with more Category 3 or higher storms being recorded than ever before. These disaster events aren't the only weather events causing damage. Summers are getting hotter and longer. The extreme heat driving this is quietly becoming a major threat to both the environment and people's health. Let's go back to Bernard Smith, who's reporting from Maryland, where he met Americans having to adapt to this new normal.
Instead of leaving the yard at 5, we leave the yard at 4, and really to try to beat that heat.
It's 6 a.m., already 25 degrees Celsius, and Brian Williams and his colleagues have been on shift for a couple of hours. These sanitation workers in Maryland, in the northeastern United States, have been starting work before dawn since the beginning of June for the last 3 years. The state started mandating new summer working conditions after a 36-year-old sanitation worker in Baltimore died from heat stroke.
I don't know, for me, all I say, and I watch what I eat, drink a lot of water, I stay hydrated.
Do you feel it on your body?
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. See, right now it's cool. When it's like 10:30, 11 o'clock, that's when it's tough. You slow down, you can't move fast.
It'll hit 40 degrees Celsius in Maryland today. Prince George County Council designates some public buildings as cooling centres. Anyone young enough takes advantage of one of the best ways to beat the heat. 50 years ago, there were 2 heat waves a year across major cities in the northeastern United States. Now there are at least 6, and they're lasting longer. A 1970s heat wave might have broken after 48 hours. Now they can last for multiple days. And there used to be just 5 to 10 days a year where temperatures exceeded 32 degrees Celsius. Now that happens regularly for 20 to 30 days a year. Maryland mandates 15-minute breaks every hour when the temperature hits 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 38 degrees Celsius.
122 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow. And then if we go back to the grass, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So
Tim Canty researches air quality science and policy and climate change.
I think in a lot of environmental issues, let's just say we're more reactive than proactive. You deal with the current emergency and then you're forced to move on to the next emergency. And I think for municipalities, there's not often time to catch your breath and say, okay, how do we deal with this so it doesn't happen in the future? Though there are numerous communities that are talking about that. Planting more trees, more green spaces, parks, things that not only help mitigate the heat, but also beautify the area as well and benefit people.
Mitigating the consequences of climate change is clearly possible at a local level. But combating the root causes of what's heating the planet, well, that'll take national and international cooperation. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Prince George's County, Maryland.
And we are joined now by Joshua Sacs, who is the Adaptation Program Director at the Georgetown Climate Center, and Nicolas Loris, who's the President at C3 Solutions, which is a group focusing on energy, climate, and environmental policy. Joshua, Nick, thank you both for joining me on what is actually a relatively fine day during a very, very hot summer. Josh, I want to start with you. This extreme heat that Bernard was really highlighting there all across the country, is this America's new summer reality?
Yes. It is. We're seeing the climate warm, and then we're seeing weather events that exacerbate that. And I think what we're seeing today is not only the new reality, it's just a taste of what's to come.
So this is a permanent shift that Americans are now going to have to figure out how to grapple with.
At least permanent for the next 100 or so years, yes.
So yes, for all intents and purposes. Nick, climate change is happening. It's a consensus that people are fueling this, and that we as a planet are making little progress at fighting it. So how do we need to respond in this moment?
Yeah, the best thing we can do in the near term is better resiliency and adaptation to help communities and help families weather these storms. There's a lot of opportunities in the near term for better forest management, to build more resilient buildings and roads, and have seawalls to help from extreme weather across the board. I think in the intermediate to longer term, and what we're hopeful for is to make clean energy cheap and really drive global decarbonization, because it really needs to be in the economic self-interest of both Americans, but also global populations. If climate policies are too expensive, if it means raising people's energy bills, raising prices at the pump, if it means less economic growth, it's going to turn people off, whether you're in a developed country or an emerging economy. And so the goal is to really drive down the cost of everything from renewables to nuclear power to geothermal, so we can have deep decarbonization. And we're making progress there. We need to do a lot more.
What are the adaptation tactics, Joshua, that you are looking at most closely or most optimistic about?
I think the best adaptation practices are where we're looking holistically across government and trying to solve people's problems. Adaptation isn't just living in the disaster cycle and responding to the next disaster. It's meeting people where they are. It's realizing that climate adaptation is changing how you take your kids to school, or how you spend a weekend, or how you insulate your home. It's going to ultimately require changing how we live and what cities look like and the buildings we live in. And I think that takes all of government to do at the state level, using federal money, and that's what we're looking for.
When, we're always thinking about emissions and those contributing to the warming planet. Nick, when you think about cutting emissions versus these adaptive tactics, things that we can be doing proactively, how do you sort of break it down? Where should the focus be?
Yeah, I think it's a yes and they don't need to be mutually exclusive. We know that we're going to need a lot more power. For the last 2 decades, electricity demand in the U.S. was relatively flat, and that is no longer the case because of the fact that we have hyperscalers and data centers coming here, that we have more industrialization in the United States, and we have more electrification of the economy. So we need to have that cheaper, cleaner energy. And at the same time, we have to do all the things that Joshua was talking about as well, is to make communities more resilient, make homes more resilient. And yes, resources are constrained, but we can also make it easier to do these things. One of the hottest topics for the last few years in Washington, D.C., and increasingly at the state level has been permitting reform. And so permitting reform helps everything from clean energy to accomplishing these resiliency projects much more cost effectively and in a timely fashion.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing essentially is that there have to be strategies at the local, state, national, and of course international levels. Because we're focusing on the heat here in the United States, I want to take a look at where this is happening. Extreme weather can hit almost anywhere, but some places are indeed more vulnerable than others. Between 2020 and 2024, extreme weather led to at least 2,520 deaths across the United States. Hurricanes and severe storms do some of the worst damage in the southeastern part of the country. Flooding and unpredictable tornadoes, they regularly hit the states in the Midwest. And then wildfires and heat waves cause destruction across the West and the Southwest. And then in the Northeast, severe Atlantic storms, they're called nor'easters, they arrive alongside hurricane season in the autumn. So, Joshua, we saw Bernard out there with workers in Maryland. Let's get into the economics of this a little bit. What happens when it's too dangerous, too hot for workers to be outside?
Well, one of two things happens. Either they continue working at the peril of their own health, or then they lose productivity, or workplaces need to figure out new ways to accommodate them. We might need to put in less hours. We might need to shift the hours. We might need to add cooling. The bottom line is heat and other climate hazards are going to cause major economic upheaval, and it impacts people who are out in the open, who are out in the heat the most. We need to do whatever we can to help them.
What are you seeing in terms of movement, people moving away from places where there is extreme heat or extreme weather patterns?
I think we are seeing some movement because of climate hazards. It's hard to attribute exactly why and where people are going. We tend to see the most movement happening because of flood. And it still is true that if you look at a lot of things like studies from Zillow and others, a lot of people are moving into very hot areas, very dry areas. So it's not necessarily true that we're even fleeing those places yet.
So to what extent do you think there's a recognition of what is happening and what is coming?
I think there's a lot of recognition. People are experiencing this day to day. When I go to a barbecue, people want to talk about the heat or the drought and how it's impacting their lives. So I think at the end of the day, this is really just about doing everything we can to change how society is doing everything. Every type of business needs to change. How we build buildings, how we treat our workers, when we play soccer. That's what climate change is doing.
Nick, when there is this prolonged heat, what does that do to our food and water sources and the farms that produce so much of the food for the country and that we export?
Yeah, it's one of the many sectors that is impacted by more extreme heat days and then longer durations too. It's not just the fact that the temperatures are getting hotter, it's just that also you're going from maybe 40 days per year to 60 or 70 days per year, and that really strains agricultural productivity. And so that means farmers are trying to figure out ways to grow weather-resistant crops. We need more research and development into how that's done. But this can be one of the many costs, not just to the industry itself, but also the inflationary pressures that we've seen that Americans are facing at the grocery store. If we have fewer supplies of the staple goods that American families rely on, that's only going to increase the costs. And it's one of the many costs that we're seeing as a result of extreme heat across the country.
I do want to highlight some of these costs because extreme weather is costing the U.S., as Nick was just saying, more every year. In the 1980s, extreme weather-related disasters cost around $22 billion a year. That's according to the National Centers for Environmental Information. And then in the 1990s, that number reached $33.5 billion each year. In the 2000s, that figure doubled to $62 billion. That was in part due to Hurricane Katrina, which was in 2005. And then it kept on rising to nearly $100 billion a year in the 2010s. Finally, in the first half of this decade, the cost of disasters reached nearly $150 billion a year. In 2025, the Trump administration paused collection of this data by the National Centers for Environmental Information. And I want to get into the Trump administration in just a moment. But Nick, picking back up on what you were just saying about the costs, what kind of investments need to be made, can be made, so that the families at a local level are not bearing the cost for things that are very much out of their control?
Yeah, well, as the initial segment mentioned, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So the more that communities, whether that's at the local government, the state government, can be proactive in ensuring that the roads are more resilient, that buildings are more resilient, that we have opportunities to make cost-effective investments into making homes more resilient, that's going to be better for families as well. If you think about some of these staple goods that Americans rely on that have higher costs right now, especially electricity, which is increasing at more than double the rate of inflation right now, we're going to need more energy supply as well. And so the fact that we can build more efficiently, that we can grow crops more efficiently, that's going to increase the supply to help withstand some of the economic burdens that Americans are facing right now as we continue to decarbonize the economy.
On the power front, Joshua, what's coming down the pike? Are the U.S. power grids ready for that?
No, I don't think they are, especially in a heat wave when people are running their air conditioners at capacity and they need to maintain health. The grid is suffering. We have other large loads that are exacerbating that problem, data centers and others. And in these high heat moments, we are straining the grid. You're seeing states like Arizona, when they create their statewide heat plan, say we need to look at that. We need to bring in people and study the grid reliability as part of dealing with heat. So I think it's pretty well known that the grid is being strained and that to keep people safe in these heat conditions, we need to make sure the grid is reliable.
so much talk about air conditioning this summer because, of course, the Europeans are seeing extreme heat as well, and they don't have nearly as much AC as we do over here. So, Nick, how do you balance that, the need, the necessity of AC with the draw that it pulls off of the power grid?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a necessity and increasingly a necessity in parts of the United States that previously we didn't need it. If you look at some of the most extreme heat cases where we saw communities suffering, and that's, low-income communities, elder populations, communities of color. If you think about an area like the Pacific Northwest, which historically has not needed to have air conditioning, that's where we saw a lot of the deaths and fatalities over the past few years in 2020 and 2023, I believe. And so we are going to need that power. And I think that speaks to the need to build more power generation, build more transmission lines to actually bolster the grid so it is secure. So one, that it becomes more affordable and we increase supply, but it also does become more resilient so we don't have rolling brownouts and blackouts at a time when American families need that air conditioning the most.
I want to take a broader look at some of the patterns that we're seeing, because what were once unusual extreme weather events are now becoming much more frequent. Our Eva McKen dives deeper into what's happening and why.
It feels like every year America experiences another once-in-a-generation weather event. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, the United States is expected to continue to warm faster than other parts of the world. Scientists say climate change is making these extremes more likely and more intense. When you look at the overall climate, the average over many years, it's telling a story. Just this month, more than 75 centimeters of rain fell in south central Texas over 3 days, leading to emergency water rescues, just 1 year after the prior regional disaster. In July 2025, over 50 centimeters of rain came down in hours across the Guadalupe River Basin, causing more than 100 fatalities and the deadliest flood event in decades. As we burn coal, oil, and natural gas, greenhouse gases trap more heat in the atmosphere, raising Earth's average temperature. It's a heat dome. Think of it as a giant lid of high pressure that traps hot air near the ground. The extra heat makes summers warmer, and it leads to more extreme weather. In January 2025, entire communities in Southern California burned to the ground, left with a $61.2 billion price tag, making it the most expensive wildfire disaster on record in the country. Over the last decade, an average of about 63,000 wildfires burned more than 28,000 square kilometers annually. That's nearly triple compared to averages from the 1990s. In Washington state this season, these fires have threatened tribal lands, prompting evacuation orders. EPA's analysis indicates racial and ethnic minority communities are particularly vulnerable to the greatest impacts of climate change. The U.S. Weather Agency expects 8 to 14 named tropical storms in the coming months, and warmer ocean waters can fuel storms that strengthen more rapidly and dump heavier rainfall. All of these things are part of decades of scientific evidence showing a warming planet in the throes of a climate crisis.
I'm going to pick up on something that Eva just mentioned. Joshua, to what extent is your status, if you will, your socioeconomic status, correlated with how much you are being affected by extreme weather, extreme heat?
It is, they are connected. It is absolutely true that people who have lower socioeconomic status have a harder time adapting to climate change. If you live in a flood-prone community, you might not have the money to elevate your house, or you might not be able to latch your roof to protect yourselves from a hurricane. If you are dealing with heat, you might not be able to run your air conditioner. We see people who live in congregate care facilities, in nursing homes, really struggle because they can't leave the heat or the flood. So certainly where you sit in the social order impacts how well you are positioned to adapt.
How much, Nick, are states having to fend for themselves because of a lack of support from the federal government?
Yeah, that's increasingly becoming the case. And I think states have always been thinking about what's uniquely different to their state. But a lot of times, as we saw with that map, extreme heat and extreme weather is affecting all parts of the country now. And so we're hoping that states with their resources can band together. We can have more collaboration, more knowledge sharing about what's working at the state level, what's working at the local level to better prepare these communities if the federal funding isn't there.
We, of course, saw President Trump and his first administration pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. In this second Trump administration, we've seen climate offices being shut down in different departments. And then there's the Environmental Protection Agency. The head of the EPA, Lee Zeldin, he has praised the lifting of emission standards that were put on vehicles put in place by prior administrations. Take a listen.
The endangerment finding and the regulations that were based on it didn't just regulate emissions. It regulated and targeted the American dream. And now the endangerment finding is hereby eliminated, as well as all greenhouse gas emission standards that followed. The red tape has been cut.
So pride there from Lee Zeldin about the emission standards that had been done away with. Joshua, what do you make of the administration's approach to the fighting climate change broadly and these weather events specifically?
Science is pretty clear that human pollution is causing climate change. The rescinding of the endangerment finding goes against that science. And I think what we're seeing after many years of predictions of what could happen in a climate change scenario, we're actually living it now.
And Nick, what's your sense of what they've done or not done in this case?
Yeah, well, I think both parties should be frustrated by the climate policy in the United States. I think there's been an over-reliance on the executive branch, which is why we've seen this regulatory ping-ponging of climate policy and climate regulations dating back to the Bush administration, but to the Obama administration, which had its Clean Power Plan that got thrown out by the Supreme Court. And so we haven't had a lot of certainty into federal climate policy because of this over-reliance on the executive branch, which really means Congress needs to speak up and put together a comprehensive package that helps drive innovation in clean energy, drive permitting reform, and allows these technologies to flourish. I think that's what's going to be best for American consumers, and that's what's ultimately going to drive decarbonization in the United States and the rest of the world.
This is such an extraordinary political hot potato, and I think you'd all agree that we haven't been in more politically divisive times. Joshua, do you think that the effort to rally people to fight climate change, to adapt to some of the events that we've seen lately, do you think that we've become too politically divisive to be effective there?
When it comes to reducing carbon pollution at the federal level, perhaps. I don't know. What I work on is helping states and communities adapt to climate change and deal with climate hazards. And I will tell you that is a very bipartisan thing. Republicans, Democrats, red state, blue states want to stop flooding. They want to protect their citizens. They want to protect their communities. So in my work, I find that it's far more partisan or far more shared, connected work than people think.
Nick, do you agree? Is this something that now that it is such a reality and we are seeing this right in front of us, that it is perhaps less political in some ways?
In some ways, for sure. I think if you look at the western states, both red and blue, dealing with wildfires, if you look at the Midwest and the agricultural red communities that are dealing with agricultural strains, and if you look at just the general notion that I think that we do want to be proactive on being a leader in American competitiveness and energy innovation, even the House Republican Climate Caucus is the second largest caucus for House Republicans right now. And so there's a lot of members who are interested in this. I think that work is happening behind the scenes. There's a lot of areas to work together on nuclear energy, on geothermal, on adaptation and resilience. So I am more optimistic that we can work together to get something done.
We have seen some extraordinary wildfires this summer in Europe, in Canada, and we felt the smoke all the way down here in Washington, D.C. Joshua, is this simply part and parcel of everything that we've been discussing? Is there anything that we have learned as a result of these fires this summer?
I think this is sort of the new normal, and we can just expect more. It'll continue to happen. We didn't used to think of Europe as a wildfire continent, but now look at what's happening in Spain and France. This is the new normal.
We've seen them in Greece and elsewhere, and as we ourselves experience this summer, when it happens to a neighbor, then we're feeling the effects as well. When you do look at other countries, Nick, what are some things that you think this country can learn from how others are adapting?
Yeah, and I was over in Turkey last year speaking at a wildfire conference that the United Nations put on, and they're wrestling with the same things that we are. One, it's they're fighting over budget dollars, and so they're trying to be more proactive and preventative as well. But it's the case where a lot of these communities are still reactive, but they're also understanding that in places like the U.S. and Canada, if we can lead efforts for better forest management, so we have controlled burns and we have timber grazing in these lands that make these wildfires be able to burn through rather than burn up and over like we've seen, there's going to be opportunities not to zero them out. We're always going to have wildfire risk in the United States, but there are areas where we can make proactive forest management an opportunity to reduce the costs, both the economic and environmental costs of these wildfires, and reduce the risks of them happening.
And of course, to state the very obvious, all of this is so incredibly interconnected. And it's unclear if we're pushing forward with the enthusiasm and the creativity that we need to in this moment. Joshua Sacs, Nicolas Loris, thank you both for joining me today at a very important moment on a very important subject. Really appreciate it. And that's all from myself and the team here in Washington. I want to hand it back to Bernard Smith and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. Thanks so much for joining us.
We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of This is America. We're on Monday to Friday at 18:30 GMT. That's 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time if you're here in the United States. We'll see you then.